Minister Edwin Tong.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the various members for speaking and expressing support for the bill. I'll go straight into the queries that have been raised and try and address as many of them as I can. Mr. Louis Ng and I think Mr. Louis Chua and Mr. Leon Pereira asked about the concessionary relief. Mr. Ng in particular asked what the planning objectives are that we intend to achieve by the grant of relief in Section 13. The provisions in Section 13 enable the continuation of existing concessionary reliefs from DC currently already provided for in the Planning Act. It will also make provision for future concessionary reliefs for developments that promote sustainable development of land and which balances the interests of current and future generations of Singaporeans. An example of the continued provision for concessionary relief for change of use proposals within conserved buildings to incentivize the restoration of conserved buildings, I think a point that Mr. Pereira also touched on, and the adaptive reuse of conserved buildings. This is necessary to promote more optimal use of land, whilst at the same time maintaining Singapore's cultural heritage. Mr. Wee also asked for examples of concessionary relief to encourage construction productivity. Any future relief schemes will be gazetted according to purposes and objectives set out in Section 13 of the bill. Appropriate measures will be considered to ensure that these objectives, as we have set out in this bill for the relief schemes, will be achieved. And the Ministry of National Development will share more about this when they are ready. Mr. Wee asked about the use of LBC collections. I think Mr. Chua did as well, and so did Mr. Ng, and whether LBC collections will reduce the amount of future borrowing needed for long-term national infrastructure projects. Let me first clarify that LBC is a consolidation of 3 existing revenue streams. They don't seek to enhance this. It's really, as I mentioned at the outset, the existing framework is preserved, is just put under one collection agency, and the LBC will be converted, will be the name used for all 3 converted into LBC. So the consolidation is therefore not expected to result in a market increase in the amount of revenue. Indeed, the revenue to be collected will of course depend on the extent to which developers and landowners make an application for enhancement or intensification, which triggers the use of LBC. Clause 57 of the bill requires all LBC collections to be paid into the consolidated fund. The LBC would thus be a part of the public monies available for this House for appropriate expenditures that benefit Singaporeans as a whole. It will not be earmarked specifically for one purpose or one project, but it will be available generally in the fund to benefit Singaporeans as a whole. And this, Mr. Speaker, would include the funding of infrastructure, of services, public programs, including projects that benefit the local community, as well as broader national ones, such as the Singapore Green Plan. For major infrastructure spend that is critical to Singapore's development, we've just talked about the Singapore Bill. This would smoothen hefty costs, which could run into tens of billions of dollars. By doing so, we will no longer need to pay for the costs upfront from our operating revenue, and that's part of the government's differentiated financing strategy for different types of expenditure. Mr. Louis Ng asked whether the Minister's power to grant general exemptions will be exercised in line with the purposes of the Act. Mr. Pereira and I think Mr. Chua also did. The short answer is yes, that's set out in Section 5. Mr. Ng may also wish to note that Sections 12 and 13 require that every order made to grant an exemption or provide for concessionary relief must be presented in Parliament as soon as possible after publication in the Gazette. So members of this House will be directly informed of the making of these exemptions when these are made. I think Mr. Chua also made a point about this. Mr. Ng asked how the government will recover the benefits accrued by developers from unlawful development of land. The purpose of the LBC bill is to impose a tax on the increase in the value of land arising from a chargeable consent. It does not provide for a penalty tax to be collected for unlawful developments when no such consent is granted. So if you have something that is done in breach of the restrictive covenant, for example, then subsequently when the permission is granted, not only will the DP or the relevant DC or DDL be collected, there will also be a penalty amount levied on top of that, up to 30%, as I mentioned at the outset. For unlawful developments involving a breach of planning control, the URA under the Planning Act today may issue an enforcement notice, and the notice may require the removal of any unlawful structures and the reinstatement of land to its former site. Mr. Don Wee asked whether SLA will continue to review the table of rates every 6 months with IRAS. I think Mr. Pereira also touched upon this. Yes, it will be. Mr. Chua as well, I think, raised this point. It will be reviewed. It'll be reviewed to ensure that it continues to be updated, and the circumstances under which the assessment of LBC by valuation is required. That's similar to what is done for the DC table of rates today. So as I said, the framework does not differ. To Mr. Pereira's question as to whether there will be a wholly new system, the answer, as I think, is quite clear from what I said at the outset, and also my last statement, that no, it will not be a wholly new system. It will be similar to the existing framework. In fact, it's a consolidation of the existing framework, which is why we felt that no public consultation was necessary in this case. Valuations are required in specific circumstances where the table of rates might not be applicable, in circumstances which I've outlined earlier, such as for unique development, like, for example, golf courses, theme parks, where there might not be a suitable or comparable use group or sufficiently rich source of data available. Taxable persons might also opt to use LBC by valuation in lieu of the table of rates. Mr. Pereira might wish to know that this system of having a valuer as an option, apart from the chief valuer, is currently already available, and there has not been any specific difficulty associated with that. Mr. Murali asked if the DP system will continue outside the lifting of restrictive covenants. And I think specifically Mr. Murali cited the example of remnant land parcels, odd pieces of land which could be put together and developed upon. Mr. Murali's point, I think, is that these odd pieces by themselves are not capable of independent development, but with amalgamation, they may have the potential to bring about enhancement. Landowners who wish to purchase remnant state land will continue to have to pay a land premium as consideration to SLA for the remnant land parcel, and the LBC applicable for any chargeable consent thereafter granted on their private land parcel as a result of that amalgamation. So I think, to answer Mr. Murali's point, if you decide to put together the parcels and you need a chargeable consent to be given in respect of, say, a restrictive covenant to be lifted, then an LBC will be levied in that respect. Mr. Murali also asked for the government's position on the applicability of the LBC in relation to court decisions, citing examples such as the lifting of easements or restrictions, dominant servant tenement example, which may then result in land value. A court's decision to vary an easement or a restriction would not in itself constitute a chargeable consent. So in itself, it is not a chargeable consent under the LBC Act. So if you have a piece of land, you are subject to a court decision, the court rules one way or another on the construction of the easement, for example, that itself will not amount to a chargeable consent. What the court does is making a pronouncement as to the proper construction of the easement already existing, as to what it should entail. But having said that, it can certainly affect the value of land, and I think that's Mr. Murali's point. And this will certainly be taken on board in a valuation. Should chargeable consent by the state be granted subsequently with respect to this piece of land, with the court's decision taken into account? So the court decision per se on itself, it will not be a chargeable consent, but if subsequently, in the context of the decision taken by the court to vary or lift or otherwise construe a restriction in a positive manner, that will be taken into account in the end as an enhancement in the land value. And I hope that clarifies Mr. Murali's point. I should clarify to this House that LBC is not a tax to cream off any transaction that leads to an appreciation in land value. In other words, if you develop in non-land ways, not ways not related to the land, the LBC is not designed to cream off those appreciations. The liability to pay LBC arises only when the state grants a chargeable consent by allowing the landowner to develop the land further or bearing a restrictive covenant in the state title so that you can do something which you previously could not do under the title, in keeping with the principle in Clause 5 that those who benefit financially when permission to develop the land is given should share some of that gain with the community. And I think that is also a point raised by almost all of the members who spoke on this point. Mr. Pereira raised several specific questions, and I'll just address them very quickly. On the question of an IPC, I think Mr. Pereira's point is some might not be registered as a charity, so it might be a society with an IPC status. The regulations will consider this and will take this into account, even if you are not registered as a charity but have IPC status. Stamp duty is not leviable on the LBC, as the LBC is a tax, as Mr. Pereira had pointed out. In relation to the renewal of leases, leasehold interest for state leases, a land renewal premium is paid, not the LBC. In terms of the LBC between the landlord and tenant, I think both Mr. Chua and Mr. Pereira raised this. Yes, it is collectible from the parties who have a material interest, and that includes, in the context of a landlord and tenant, the tenant itself. The tenant may have recourse to the landlord for any portion that landlord ought to bear, but the provisions here set out the mechanism by which the state is able to levy the LBC as against any persons with an interest in the land. And as members would know, that includes the tenant. To Mr. Chua's point, if there's a dispute as to the valuation or disputes as to the way in which the table of rates is used, that dispute is taken to the minister, whose decision would be final. On Mr. Pereira's question as to whether there can be a deferment if one can't pay the LBC, well, in the context of most cases, LBC is levied in a situation where there is an enhancement in the value of land. So typically a landowner or developer who obviously would have done his sums would come, make a proposal, want to develop a piece of land, and obviously the intention behind that development is enhancement of land value. So such a situation would not often arise. But should it arise, that is something that can be taken into account as a matter of discretion, and you look at the entire context of the situation in considering the appropriate deferment, if any. As to timing of the payment raised by Mr. Pereira, both the LBC and the DP are payable after PP, but before the WP, before the written permission. So I think I've covered as many of the points which I think are salient. With that, sir, I beg to move.
Any clarifications? Very good. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Land Betterment Charge Bill.
Committee stage, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill.
The question is that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill. As many as of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Question is that clauses 1 to 68 stand part of the bill. As many as of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Bill to be reported. Minister for Law.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to report that the bill has been considered in committee and agreed to without amendment.
Third reading, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many as of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Land Betterment Charge Bill.
Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that at its rising today, Parliament do stand adjourned to 10:30 a.m. tomorrow.
The question is that at its rising today, Parliament do stand adjourned to 10:30 a.m. tomorrow. As many as of the opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that Parliament do now adjourn.
The question is that Parliament do now adjourn